to introduce Dr. Matthew Sparke from the University of Washington. Dr. Sparke holds dual appointments in geography, an obscure field, Professor Dodd, and also at the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Dr. Sparke is well known in the field of globalization. He recently published a book in 2013, Introduction to Globalization, which I am told is a massive bestseller because Shoreline adopted it in fall. So we expect a little bit of kickback from Dr. Sparke. So Dr. Sparke does have a great deal of expertise in this area, and tonight he's going to talk to us about the myths of globalization. I know a little bit about this, which is why I'm here excited, because I also teach a bit of international studies and do talk about this idea that globalization is apparently, for some people, a new phenomena, but we can look back in history and see some of the other events of globalization. There's also some myths that he'll try to address that we actually was a little bit in that gapminder. Is globalization leveling the playing field? He's a student from Oxford University, and from the University of British Columbia. So he is both from the other to the far east and to the cold north, and he worked his way down here to the Seattle area. Dr. Sparke will discuss for about 40 minutes his perspectives on globalization and then open it up to conversation and question and answers. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sparke.
Thank you. Great. You can hear me, everyone? Excellent. Thanks very much for that kind intro. And thank you, Larry, for organizing all of this this evening, inviting me and giving me excellent directions. I'm late completely on my own accord, but I'm so glad I'm now here with you all. And I hope I can speak briefly enough and concisely enough that we have plenty of time for a conversation. It's great to see so many of you here. And as I've told Larry before, I'm a big fan of what happens at all the community colleges around the Seattle area. I think it's immensely important work that goes on in all the community colleges. And I haven't got cash kickback, but I hope this talk is a sort of a contribution to the ongoing work that goes on here, and the ongoing deliberations that go on here. My book on globalization is called Introducing Globalization, and in some respects what I'm going to offer you tonight is a kind of introduction to the introduction. If you are interested in more of it, I have one of these so-called massive open online courses on the same topic that lasts 10 weeks that is coming, well, there's one running right now, just started this week on a platform called Canvas Network. And then there's another platform called edX that it will start on in April. I can tell you more about that at the end and talk about things like MOOCs, massive open online courses, as illustrations like Hans Rosling's talk about global health of the huge variety of ways in which the world is becoming integrated. 10 years ago, people would not, even just 10 years ago, people were not able to take a course that connected students from all over the world in a single classroom. And now that's happening on a fairly routine basis. And it's just one of many examples of the ways in which the world is becoming integrated. But as I tell students, and as I explain it at length in my book, globalization is more than just integration. Certainly, we have to look at globalization as a pattern of increasing global interdependency, or more technically, the extension, acceleration, and intensification of consequential worldwide interconnections. It's a bit of a mouthful, but a way of capturing the diverse economic, political, social, cultural, ecological connections that have been intensified in the latter half of the 20th century and continue to intensify today. I call all of that process of global integration globalization with a little g. But globalization is another thing too. It's a discourse. It's a very powerful term and set of ideas, visions about the world that are used frequently in political speech, both by critics of various forms of capitalist market integration and by advocates of that same capitalist market integration. Globalization has become a very contested term as a result. And part of the power of the discourse about globalization is that it kind of mythologizes some of the patterns of integration and makes them seem like there's only one political and economic response that makes sense. And that's what particularly interests me and what I want to talk about in the rest of the talk this evening. I call this sort of meta-discourse, this sort of more larger-than-life or hyperbolic way of talking about globalization with a big G. And for my students, I think it's helpful to make this distinction. One last point before I turn to the next slide. A lot of other academics who write books about globalization and who try to use empirical evidence to explore the various patterns of integration and their unevenness, what they often tend to do is set up the terms of debate in what I call an academic three-step. Or you could sort of see it as a sort of a dance almost. They say, I'm going to try and take a neutral, objective academic path down the middle. But there are some people who are complete skeptics about globalization over here. They don't believe it's happening. And there are these hugely exaggerated accounts of globalization on the other side, the hyper-globalists who exaggerate too much. I'm not going to exaggerate too much, and I'm not going to be a skeptic. I'm going to chart this empirically based, robust middle way. That's the kind of a typical three-step you see at the introduction of pretty much any globalization textbook. And I sort of engage in it a little bit in my own book, too. I do say I'm going to use empirical evidence to examine the actual patterns of integration. But the problem with this three-step, from my point of view, is that it ignores or tries to push to one side what is at stake in the battle between the skeptics and the hyper-globalists. And what I'm interested in getting at by talking about globalization as a big G discourse is precisely that struggle between the exaggerators and the skeptics. Because often what's at stake in their contentions with one another is the sort of the political baggage that comes with discourse about big G globalization. So let's turn to that discourse now. And a typical representative of it, who writes regularly in the New York Times on globalization, Thomas Friedman, an op-ed columnist who I'm sure many of you have read. And since even before his book, The World is Flat, which went very global, his earlier book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, was also talking about globalization at length. And Friedman sort of successfully shifted from being a foreign affairs correspondent and prior to that, a business page correspondent, to being an op-ed writer who specialized in talking about globalization. So he sort of made a nice sort of segue from those other things into the op-ed realm, with globalization being his sort of calling card. He said, I feel about globalization a lot like I feel about the dawn. Generally speaking, I think it's a good thing that the sun comes up every morning. It does more good than harm. But even if I didn't care that much, there isn't much I could do about it. I didn't start globalization. I can't stop it except at huge cost to human development. And I'm not going to waste time trying. All I want to think about is how I can get the best out of this new system and cushion the worst for the most people. And Bill Clinton, when he was president, said something similar too. He said, globalization is not something we can hold off or turn off. It is the economic equivalent of a force of nature, like wind or water. Now, these sorts of evocations of globalization start to become myth-making when they use the natural metaphors, dawn, wind, water, the force of nature. When they use these natural metaphors to naturalize globalization, to say it's automatic, it's something like the dawn which will come naturally and predictably, and use nothing as human beings we can do to shape it or stop it. And I argued in my book and to my students that there are three big myths that get deployed regularly when globalization is naturalized in that way. First of all, we see globalization being described again and again as new. This is a new thing. It's a juggernaut that's just coming right at us, and it's brand new. We've got to adapt. We've got to change our ways to adapt to this new, this kind of like a storm coming our way. An example of a politician doing that, you probably think of many American politicians who have made appeals to the global market, new globalization, the new economy, to make claims for political change. But Tony Blair is a typical figure in this respect. Following Margaret Thatcher's footsteps, he argued in Britain as the Labour Party leader that the new world market, which today is industrially and financially transformed, demands a new economic policy. It's the newness here that is being rolled out, and it's a typical rhetorical gesture that's invoked again and again. Another myth that's repeated again and again is that globalization is inevitable. Kim Dae-jung from Korea, just another example, saying globalization is a historically inevitable path. And then I have here as an example of a third myth that I think is also problematic, Michael Eskew saying that globalization and expanded trade is a great equalizer. Now, you might all be thinking, well, those claims are not entirely mythological. You know, there's some truth to them. But I expect that's like there is some newness. There is something seemingly unstoppable about the way the world is becoming integrated, and there is a way in which it is diminishing barriers and the distances that previously separated societies. So there is something to these accounts. But what happens, again, when globalization is rolled out as this very powerful big G discourse, is that the myths start to do a lot of political work. And that's what I'm really interested in. They're a way of talking about the world, they're a way of envisioning the world, and they're a way of, more philosophically put, worlding the world, of conceptualizing the world in a singular way that kind of prepares the ground for a particular kind of political program. In other words, the myths simplify reality in order to shape reality. That's the movement that I think needs to be looked at carefully. They're simplifying in order to shape. But there are problems with all of them, and I've been talking thus far as if there are problems, so let me spell out what the problems from my perspective actually are. First of all, the claim that it's new. Well, that's problematic when you start to think about the histories of global interconnection. This is the front cover of a book that was actually given to me by my grandfather growing up in England. The Wonder Book of Empire, would you believe? And now you can just imagine me as a little 5-year-old going, ooh, that is a wonder, ooh, that's really amazing. But the front cover, which I quite enjoyed as a kid, thinking, oh, that's a beautiful cover, illustrated how for many British people back in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, when books like this were coming out, there was already a kind of globalization underway. It was the British Empire. It connected all these pink parts of the map up around the world, and they were all shown in books like this to be deeply interconnected into one political and economic system of regulation and of economic production, and of cultural conformity to some extent, of British attempts to civilize their empire. And that was just one earlier example of a form of global integration. And other European countries, of course, had their empires. And going back historically, we've seen many other kinds of antecedents to today's global integration. The Silk Road being another very early example. And when you think about some of these former examples, the transatlantic triangular trade and global empires and the Silk Road, it's not that they are not entirely disconnected from what's happening with globalization today. The centers of empires in the past have inherited forms of authority and enduring forms of power as a result of the influence that they held in previous rounds of globalization. The British economy is tiny now in the global scheme of things, and yet London, along with New York City, Tokyo, is a huge center of global finance. And you can't understand that without understanding how Britain's situation, and London's situation in particular, inherited a certain kind of privilege from that prior round of global integration that was organized through a series of European empires. So understanding, it's not just that the myth that globalization is new sort of misses that history, but to understand how globalization is being organized today through global cities like London, you have to understand that history. And that's one of the things that the newness talk tends to obscure. The argument that globalization is inevitable is a favorite one of many politicians. It's a favorite claim by people who want to argue that there's nothing that can be done to change the global macroeconomic situation, and all that political leaders have to do is readjust, change their labor policies, change their welfare policies, change their trade policies, their union policies, their monetary policies to adjust to this new world order. But of course, I don't know if that's a course, but it's always struck me as deeply paradoxical that this is the way in which politicians proceed in making claims about globalization. The reason why is that if it was truly inevitable, if it was truly all going to happen without any change, without anything we did, including all the political shifts that they're calling for, then those shifts wouldn't be needed if it was truly inevitable. It's like the critique that was made rightly against a certain brand of Marxism that said, interpreted Marx as saying, oh, well, the global revolution by the workers will inevitably come. You know, that day is going, capitalism will dig its own grave and the day of revolution is going to be upon us, which is what is the narrative that Marx and Engels use in the Communist Manifesto. And that's famously critiqued in philosophy textbooks as a form of teleology, where you're saying that everything is naturally heading towards this telos. Well, there's a teleology in the globalization is inevitable argument, and it is deeply paradoxical. And then the idea that globalization is a leveler is empirically flawed on a variety of levels. Pick any single kind of example of globalization: increasing global mobility, increasing internet access, or risks from climate change. They're all examples of shared planetary interconnection and interdependency, right? But pick any one of these, and you'll find that the experience of that interconnection is extraordinarily uneven. It's not a leveling as such. It's an integration and a form of interdependency that's emergent. But the result is by no means leveling in terms of class or in terms of shared life chances or in terms of health outcomes. Hans Rosling, to go back to that terrific video you saw at the beginning, he is optimistic, as you remember from that video. He says, we're all, if things go okay, we're all going to end up in that healthy, wealthy corner. And it's quite an appealing argument, but he makes the case in longer discussions that a lot of things have to be done to get to the healthy, wealthy corner. A lot of global health interventions have to be organized, and a lot of the socioeconomic determinants of health that create increased morbidity and mortality in some parts of the world and higher burdens of disease in some parts of the world. A lot has to be done to address those to get all the countries in the world to join that journey to the healthy, wealthy corner. And he would acknowledge, as do most people who explore global health outcomes empirically, that what we have right now around the world, and you can get maps like this map actually is is produced by a group of geographers at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and they have a wonderful website called World Mapper that does these cartograms. This cartogram expands or shrinks the size of country in order to represent the proportion of air travel per capita by citizens of that country. So you see air travel per capita in Europe and air travel per capita in the United States is very high in the global scheme of things, and air travel per capita in Africa and Latin America very small. So an example of one kind of globalization, global air travel, is very unevenly distributed. The same people do similar kinds of maps for disease too, and they look almost the mirror opposite of this one, with the burden of disease for TB, malaria, AIDS, under 5, child mortality, maternal mortality, all being burdens of disease felt much more heavily in the global south, in Latin America, particularly in Africa and South Asia. So all of these are examples of global integration, various metrics of integration, if you will, but they can be empirically documented to be highly unevenly distributed. And the idea that there's some magical leveling going on as a result of all the integration is deeply misleading. So those are some of the problems with the myths. But the myths nevertheless persist. And that's because they do important political work for the people who repeatedly use them. I grew up with this lady, the Prime Minister of Britain. And Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, was fond of saying, there is no alternative to economic reform because the global market dictates that we should liberalize, privatize, and deunionize as much as possible. So much so did she make the argument that there is no alternative that many people now talk about the Tina argument, as if Tina was a person like Tina Turner. But Tina is an acronym for there is no alternative, a sort of axiom that became Margaret Thatcher's punchline. And so many critics of the kinds of policies that she promoted, very similar, of course, to the policies that President Reagan promoted in this country, invoking economists like Milton Friedman. Margaret Thatcher invoked another Chicago-based economist, Friedrich von Hayek, who was one of the mentors for Milton Friedman. Because these folks have made those sorts of arguments so much from the 1980s onwards, there is a lot of debate over the Tina touts and a lot of doubts about the Tina touts. On the one side, you can say, yes, there are massive, hard-to-resist forces created by global interdependencies. And yes, that's a way of acknowledging that there is something new and something very powerful going on as a result of global market integration. But the critics say no, that the Tina touts are wrong in the sense that we don't have to all adopt suddenly these radically liberalized market-based policies as a sort of adaptation to global market integration. And many critics, in fact, argue the reverse, that various forms of social protection organized not just nationally but transnationally are a more adequate response to the patterns of integration that we're seeing, and that new forms of global citizenship are an important response. The problem with the myths is that naturalize globalization is that, from the point of view of these critics, the myths make it hard to imagine alternatives to these forms of market fundamentalist policy making. But I think it's important to point out at this point that the myths around globalization are not organized like as a simple form of ideology. It's not like fascist propaganda or Goebbels putting out newspapers with a particular line that everybody has to consume. This is a set of accounts of global integration that is more hegemonic. It's more commonsensical. It works through the ways in which everyday images like this one, or videos about the global economy. Think of a news show about any kind of business report that shows numbers flying around the world. All these things do help sort of conjure up a larger-than-life, big G globalization. And it's that sort of juggernaut discourse that then Tina touts lock onto to make the argument that all the reforms that are pro-market reforms that they want are natural responses to globalization. So this is where I think the discourse does its political work. It is being used repeatedly and systematically to justify pro-market policies. And I don't know, how many of you have heard, I don't want to sound, make this too simplistic if you're already very familiar with the language, but how many of you have heard the language of neoliberalism before? Okay, but, so about a third of you. But this term, neoliberalism, is often used in the academy, generally by more left-leaning scholars, it has to be said, to criticize and, first of all, to describe pro-market policies. But it's a somewhat counterintuitive term, and even if politically you don't want to align yourself with left-wing critics, I think it's a useful term to reflect on and come to understand more fully, because it's a bit counterintuitive for particularly in the American context. Because in the US, we always associate liberalism with a particular kind of liberalism, with welfare state liberalism of the mid-20th century. But that's not what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism is actually a pro-market policy rule set that is actually hearkening back to the free market liberalism of the 19th century, of economists like David Ricardo, and of the folks who came out of Manchester and argued for free trade against the British aristocracy and actually founded The Economist magazine. The Economist magazine remains a deeply pro-free trade magazine into the present, pro-market magazine into the present, but it started its life in the 19th century as a liberal magazine, not a liberal welfare state magazine, but a liberal magazine. And what distinguishes neoliberalism today is it's hearkening back to that 19th century liberalism and yet rejecting the liberalism of the welfare state in the mid-20th century, the redistributionist welfare state liberalism of the 20th century. If you want to get a good, I think, fairly rich account of the move from welfare state liberalism in the mid-20th century to neoliberalism at the end of the 20th century, I recommend this book and the video series that came with it that was on PBS, Commanding Heights. Amongst other things, if you go to the Commanding Heights website, there's a terrifically useful story map that allows you to go through the 20th century and look at the ways in which countries after, like America after the New Deal and other countries during the Depression, after Depression, became more redistributionist as they dealt with the inequalities and the crises that ultimately led to World War II. After World War II, a lot of universal rights, education, social welfare rights, housing rights, and so forth were established in many countries around the world. Of course, many countries went communist during that time too. And many countries became freed up from colonialism and became independent states who took more welfarist approaches to economic government. And then in this account, you see the story map. It unfolds into through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you see all of those moves towards state control and redistribution going back, being rolled back as the kind of tidal wave of Tina touts and appeals to globalization lead to more pro-market reforms and the pullback of the state from practices of welfare and redistribution. So that's why many scholars use the term neoliberalism, because it encodes within itself this history of liberalism, a sort of three phases, if you will, of liberalism. What it actually is in practice is this set of policies. If you wanted to kind of quickly summarize neoliberalism to anybody, someone comes up to you on the street and says, what is neoliberalism? It's these policies. Expanded free trade, privatizing public services, deregulating business, cutting public spending, reducing or flattening taxes, encouraging foreign investment, deunionizing, developing using markets rather than aid, reducing inflation, and enforcing property rights such as through land titling and honoring patents. That is the sort of the norm set, the policy norm set of neoliberalism. And what I'm really interested in is how the myth-making around globalization is used to justify the adoption, the expansion, and the entrenchment of those policies. Thomas Friedman, to go back to where I started, is one example of that. He talks about it as a golden straitjacket, describing those norms, those political norms, as something that offer golden promise on the one side, but that straitjacket politicians on the other side. He doesn't call it a rusty straitjacket or a straitjacket that's got nails in it. He does see a certain sort of golden promise. But he also acknowledges, to be fair to him, that it is straitjacketing. So this is what you have to do to fit into the golden straitjacket to adapt to globalization, he says. To fit into the golden straitjacket, a country must either adopt or be seen as moving toward the following golden rules. And pretty much this is the neoliberal wish list. Making the private sector the primary engine of its economic growth, maintaining a low rate of inflation and price stability, shrinking the size of state bureaucracy, maintaining as close to a balanced budget as possible, if not a surplus, eliminating and lowering tariffs on imported goods, removing restrictions on foreign investment, deregulating its economy to promote as much domestic competition as possible, eliminating government, corruption, subsidies, and kickbacks as much as possible, opening its banking and telecommunication systems to private ownership and competition, and allowing its citizens to choose from an array of competing pension options and foreign-run pension and mutual funds. When you stitch these pieces together, you have the golden straitjacket. And here in the United States, perhaps the most, well, I think along with with Bill Clinton, his nemesis, Newt Gingrich was in many ways the most coherent and articulate advocate of golden straitjacketing when he helped the Republican House majority to craft this document, a set of policies called the Contract with America. Many political scientists say the contract that they drafted is what got them the majority in the first place. And in justifying the contract, this is how Newt Gingrich explained it. He said that we need to recognize the objective reality of the world market. He doesn't say globalization, but it's pretty much what he means. To realize that we create American jobs through world sales and that we need to make a conscious national decision that we want to have the highest value-added jobs on the planet with the greatest productivity so we can have the highest take-home pay and the greatest range of choices of lifestyles. In order to do that, we have to literally rethink the assumptions that grew up in a self-indulgent national economy, so the welfare state era. And we have to recognize that litigation, taxation, regulation, welfare, education, the very structure of government, the structure of health, all those things have to be re-examined from the standpoint of what will make us the most competitive society on the planet, the most desirable place to invest, to create jobs, the place with the best trained and most entrepreneurial workforce. So it really makes that connection. Global market economy, global world market, we have to adapt. It's new, these neoliberal policies are how we will adapt. I'm going to conclude, though, by saying that while the Tina touts go on, I mean, I'm sure you can all think it'd be nice, actually, to talk to you about other people you think are adapting this kind of rhetoric today. And we can talk a little bit about that if you want. But while that goes on, there are many critics of neoliberalization who argue that there are alternatives. And I think it's important to acknowledge that most of these critics are hard to label anti-globalization critics because most of their struggles are increasingly globalized. That was actually true of the case of the protesters here in Seattle back in 1999 who protested against the World Trade Organization. Thomas Friedman, amongst others, called them anti-globalization activists. But many of them had posters like that one in the top left-hand corner there that said no globalization without representation. It was hearkening back, to be sure, to the American Revolution and the nationalist rhetoric with which we got rid of those Brits. Ha! How does that sound? And that's why they had that image of revolutionaries with their drums and so forth on the banner. But what they were also demanding was a different kind of representation. Their main criticism, the Sierra Club, unions that were holding those kinds of banners and slogans in the protests in Seattle in 1999, their main protest against the WTO was that it didn't allow every stakeholder, every voice, a representational space at the table negotiating the trade agreement. Instead, it was just people representing trading organizations and economists concerned with global trade that had a voice at the table. And all sorts of other stakeholders in the global economy, environmentalists, unions, amongst them, were locked out. They didn't have representation. So what they were actually demanding was not anti-globalization, but new forms of global representation, new forms of accountability that would actually allow other stakeholders into the policy-making process. I think this is something will be very useful to talk about if you're interested in it in relation to the two big trade deals that are currently coming up and on which I think President Obama and his USTR office will probably seek to find some kind of middle ground with the Republicans, and it might actually pass as a result. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the first of these, and then there's another one, the TAFTA, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, that's coming up. And in both of these, you're going to see the debates that we saw here in Seattle in 1999 rehearsed all over again. So it's worth reflecting on what happened then to understand what's going to happen this year in Washington. But other critics of neoliberalism persist elsewhere in the world. Occupy, and many of the people who joined the Occupy movement articulated their efforts in both senses of the word articulation, joined them up and spoke them by thinking of them as a global struggle. Occupy Together was one example of that brought Occupy movement people together on the internet who were campaigning against the banks and all the groups that they blamed for causing the 2008 financial crisis. And they were organizing not just nationally, not just in Wall Street for sure, but around the planet. Many people arguing against bankers controlling the world. The folks now who have been elected to the majority party, the ruling party in Greece, the Syriza party, as you probably know, came to power riding a wave of public anger against austerity and banker control of policymaking in Europe in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Although tonight in my traffic experience coming over here, I heard the BBC report saying that there were angry street protests in Athens today against Syriza because many people in Greece were seeing them as capitulating to the Troika and the Germans and the European Central Bank. So they are imagining alternatives. They came to power imagining alternatives, but you might very well argue that once in power, they've been confronted smack bang by the machinery that holds global neoliberalism in place, including all those financial obligations, the dependency on the flow of finance. And it's very hard, even for a national government that came to power, a mandate to challenge all that, to actually do so. So we can talk about that. But there's many other examples around the world. That's all the other graphics are meant to capture here. Podemos, a parallel with Syriza in Spain. In Britain, there have been huge protests against austerity. In China, in South Korea, this image at the bottom is of the Occupy movement that took place more recently in Hong Kong, contesting Beijing, but contesting, amongst other things, the inequalities in contemporary China brought about by this extraordinarily, remarkable confluence of hyper-capitalism on the one side and communist lack of freedom on the other. And you've brought them together in contemporary China. An interesting place. I'm actually contemplating writing a Chinese edition of this book. And one of the challenges for me to think through in that respect is a word like neoliberalism even salient in the Chinese context, where there was no historic liberalism. And today, what we are seeing is hard. It's liberal for certain capital movements, but it's not liberal for speech. It's not liberal in many other ways. And so neoliberalism seems a somewhat inadequate term to use in contemporary China. Okay. I think the last thing I will leave up for us for you to look at while we have a question period is my list, with which I conclude this book, of various kinds of responses to neoliberal globalization. And it's important for me to point out at this point that I think that there are more than just these left-leaning resistance movements as represented by Occupy or Syriza or Podemos or the new Occupy movement in Hong Kong. There are also right-wing responses to globalization that are hyper-nationalistic. The Tea Party, I think, is an example of that, that are xenophobic oftentimes, anti-immigrant, and that nevertheless, so they are responses to globalization too, and I think it's important for social scientists to acknowledge that there are those other sets of alternatives out there. The alternatives aren't monopolized by any means by social justice activists and those on the left. There are many alternatives being articulated on the right and far right as well that are not accepting, if you will, of the kind of neoliberal globalization propounded by the sorts of genteel leaders that meet every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. So with that list of alternatives up there for you to sort of ponder, I think I'll bring my formal remarks to a close and just invite you all to contest what I have said or ask questions. I really welcome any comments whatsoever, but thank you very much for listening.
So in your review of the globalization, if you look back over time, not just the more recent period, if you look back over a long period of time, are there like 3 or 4 ingredients necessary for a globalization to take place, like Portugal with their trade routes,
Oh, I
the
see.
Silk Road that you mentioned,
Yeah.
the Roman Empire with all the roads and the trade centers? Are there specific principles that you've been able to pull out with your studies?
That's a really interesting question. The way many people would try to answer that would be sort of like histories of technological breakthroughs. There were certain sorts of transportation transformations that suddenly made possible a new round of integrative dynamics. But I actually am rather skeptical of putting technology at the center of the account or at the start of the account, because humans invent technology for a reason. They want it for a reason, and particularly since the emergence of capitalism in the period from the 1600s through to the 1900s, that long period of capitalism's emergence. The drivers of technological transformation have become increasingly capitalist drivers. They're not been just discoveries. They've been innovations driven by the need to speed up the process of capitalist development, whether it's getting goods to market quickly, getting access to far distant resources, or more simply, just speeding up the process through which commodities are made and turned out into the market. All of those imperatives that really come from capitalism itself have been driving the technological transformation. So I actually prefer, my bias is to put capitalism at the center of the story. And then once you do that, I think in looking at the period from the 1900s up till today, the 1800s up to the 19th century up to today, what becomes interesting is to look at how the different sort of ups and downs of capitalism lead to different patterns of integration. So one of the things that, if you do a sort of that long durée look at capitalist high points and then down points, the obvious pattern that you can draw out of that is that as capitalism grows very rapidly and expands, you see heightened globalization, heightened integration patterns. And then when there are these moments of retrenchment, like the Great Depression, communities, societies, countries pull back behind more increasingly protectionist, autarkic wars. The middle of the 20th century, which was a period of recovery, from the Depression onwards, was a period where national economies became less connected and much more autarkic. And then it was only after the growth that happened in the 50s and 60s that you started to see so quite a long period of growth that you started to see the sort of imperative towards the globalization that has led into the Reagan-Thatcher era and on to today. So that's a rather crude historical survey, but that's my sort of bias, is to put capitalism at the center of the story.
Hello? Okay, yeah. Actually, I'd be interested in your comments, but I see the whole thing as fitting something more central than capitalism, of which capitalism is a part of. And it goes back to what I believe is the basic conflict that every person goes through which is the conflict between the me, myself, and improving relationships, where the relationship varies depending on your fractal level. Everything is fractals. So it's all these relationships. Huh. And following in that, you'll find many cultures have had their relational statements or philosophy, basically the relational golden rule, something to the effect of don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. And that fits the relation, that's the improving relations. And that's always in conflict with the me, which is the noun-centered golden rule, he or she with the gold rules. Mm-hmm. And I see the capital G fitting perfectly what must follow if everything follows the noun-centered golden rule. And the small g is leading towards the relational golden rule.
Oh, that's a neat way of conceptualizing it. I think the only thing I'd add to what you said, I mean, I'm obviously not a psychologist, but I am. I think my interest would immediately be in trying to historicize the moments, so historically contextualize the moments where people's inclinations to focus on the me are heightened versus other historical moments where there's a sensitivity to the we. And I do think right now that we're living through a moment, particularly since the global financial crises of 2008, but also during a period where people are increasingly aware of global climate change, where people are increasingly aware of global health challenges. The fact that you guys were all watching Hans Rosling when I came in is indicative of that. But whenever more people are sort of feeling awareness at a vulnerability, I should say, a feeling of vulnerability and a shared vulnerability, that they're perhaps more pulled to articulating their concerns, their desires, pleasures, whatever, in terms of the we, rather than in terms of the me. At the University of Washington, we have the Global Health Department, and the previous chair of the department, King Holmes, was trying to come up with terms for the shifts in students' attitudes over time that he'd seen. And he talked about the 1980s and 1990s being a period of Generation Me. And now he said we live in a period of Generation G, the G being for global, and for him, global health. But it was definitely a historical shift that he was trying to document. And I do think we're living through a period like that right now, which is in many ways quite exciting. This January, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put out their annual letter, Bill and Melinda's annual letter, and they have an end with a call for global citizenship. And a number of my students found that very appealing. It's like, that appeal. So, yeah, I know, questions you might well ask about it, but it's the basic appeal is really there.
There's a problem, obviously, without a world cop to keep things in line. And America's kind of lost a little bit of our moral center in the last few years. Is there a replacement for our leverage? Will a United Nations ever have an ability to be the world cop? Because we look at all these countries that just destroy the hell out of each other. Mm-hmm. All the billions of dollars in equipment and buildings that are destroyed. And you think about the people who are manning the guns that are destroying all this stuff, and consider that they don't have jobs. Their job is to destroy things, because nobody will pay them enough to keep them doing something else. So there's a job component involved in the whole thing, and so it's two issues. How do you create the jobs when everybody's trying to get rid of labor costs, and how do we establish a world police force that will keep these countries from destroying each other and then having the rest of the world try and help rebuild?
Yeah, those are very big, weighty questions. And I don't want to pretend to have anything like all the answers at all. In fact, let me start with a backtrack to one of the things that I have a chapter in this book on governance. And one of the things I think it's critical to understand about neoliberal globalization is that it hasn't brought about the end of the nation state. Along with the sort of leveling discourse, you often see this sort of argument that we're living in an era where the nation state is no longer important or influential. And that's definitely part of the myth-making around big G globalization, but it is very mythic and misleading. And one of the reasons why is that to put in place all these sort of neoliberal norms, trade liberalization, privatization, deregulation, deunionization, all of those things have had to be put in place by government action. And they've actually relied upon national governments for implementation and enforcement. And it also, that in turn helps once you sort of start to see that, you also can understand how in turn national sovereignty, which endures and is being used to implement neoliberalism around the world, is often serving as an obstacle to other kinds of world government that would be more would explore other kinds of practices that might do the things that you're talking about, like coordinate in a way to grow jobs, internationally, sort of, rather than like just compete one country to another, or coordinate to raise wages at a global level, to sort of set a global minimum wage. Imagine that, or to ban child labor around the world, even start more simply, or to enforce basic health and safety at work rights around the world. We're nowhere near having any kind of UN-led initiative around those sorts of global protections for ordinary people. And one of the reasons why is, ironically, in a sense, national sovereignty. And perhaps the best example in this respect is climate change and doing something coordinated in response to that. War is another matter. It's a more complicated one, I think. But climate change really cries out for a global coordinated response, that both mitigation and adaptation. And yet, it's so hard to get there because every country that's asked to make serious reforms in its energy policy, transportation policy, or whatever, is going, first of all, to shout out national sovereignty. I don't want the UN coming in here and telling us we can't use this oil that's in the ground and we can get out with fracking or whatever. And then people would just not accept it. The Chinese government is not going to accept any kind of mandate coming from outside like that. And it's national sovereignty that is being invoked again and again. We're doing this in the name of the nation. So that's one of the sort of the extraordinary achievements of the advocates of neoliberal reform is that they've been able to, through invoking globalization with a big G, by invoking a sense that there's a single juggernaut, they've been actually able to coordinate all these national governments to implement a similar set of policies around the world. Now, when it comes to war, boy, I don't know. I mean, I just don't think. Yeah, certainly there's no police force in the offing. No, so I totally agree with you.
If I might.
Yeah, please.
The trade agreements take the ability of Americans, for instance, to speak to the food.
Yeah, democratically set national policy. You're right. I didn't mean to suggest that there aren't ways in which these global market reforms are not sort of locked in transnationally. NAFTA, WTO, EU as well does that. But even then, what those mechanisms, those free trade agreement mechanisms, all rely on is national governments coming in and saying, we agree to abide by WTO rules, we agree to abide by NAFTA rules, and then agreeing to implement them too, and agreeing to go to the tribunals and abide by the tribunals' decisions. And of course, there's a reason why national governments are willing to do that, despite the fact that it overrides national food safety issues or traffic safety issues. And that's because they want access to the markets. There's this huge pull to abide by the trade agreements because of the prospect of opening up new markets for your country's exports. So that's the mechanism through which national governments have sort of been disciplined, if you will, into enforcing some of these neoliberal reforms. Anyway, another question. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the presentation you gave. Really interesting. One of the things that's kind of been thinking about the whole time is I feel like there's a hierarchy within the globalization world. So some country might not abide by, if we draw a chart for the world, the different countries, for power, for example, to have control, have power, every country is going to abide by certain rules based on what their goal is, right? Mm-hmm. So a country would abide by, for example, the trade rules, only if it's in the benefit of itself, right? So if you have a hierarchy, a pyramid, let's say, for example, there's always people on the lower end of it and there's people on the higher. If everybody was even, you don't have that pyramid shape anymore. Now we just have a line. So there's no excitement to the line. Yeah. So where would we stand if we implemented the globalization? If
the world really was flat?
So that's what I'm saying. We are a sphere. So some have different effects from the sun in certain parts, like times of the year versus other parts. So where do we stand if the world was flat and everybody was, abide by the globalization rules? Where's the excitement? I want to say.
Where's the excitement? Well, I don't think it's ever going to happen. So the excitement is actually in all the reasons why any attempt to sort of move towards shared power relations, more equality, all of that is an ongoing struggle and is not going to happen soon or easily. One of the interesting things, sort of to pick up on the segue that you used between the two questions, one of the interesting places to look for where that struggle is unfolded is actually in the WTO. As a result of 1999 and the protests here and what happened in Seattle that year, the WTO deliberations were sort of changed ever after. And one of the interesting things about the WTO is that it has a one country, one vote rule. So it's moving more towards what you're talking about, albeit very different sized countries all have one vote. But they do have one vote each, and it's in that respect quite different from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank institutions, where voting power is pegged to your, effectively to your economic power, as it was basically enforced at the time when the institutions were started back at Bretton Woods at the end of World War II, which basically means that the US, when US was very, very powerful. But the World Trade Organization is one vote, one member, one vote. And it's actually been something of a challenge to the United States as a result. So subsequently, both in Seattle and then subsequently, developing countries said, well, okay, you guys are demanding free trade. We want free trade. The Indian government led this big campaign for the US to open up some of its grain markets more freely and let in, without any kinds of tariffs, grain exports from countries such as India. Other developing countries joined in. It's a continual complaint from Latin American countries about citrus protections and sugar protections. Brazil has huge complaints about the fact that we protect our national sugar industry here in the US. In the European context, they protect their farmers big time too, dairy farmers and so forth. And so the World Trade Organization has become a place where the Europeans and the Americans are not so comfortable anymore. And so as a result, that's why you're seeing now, I mean, they've had since 1999 really no progress on any of their deliberations, no New Deal, just enforcing existing policy. And that's why now the U.S. government's just pursuing these smaller deals, these bilateral deals and region-specific deals, because there are areas where the U.S. does want to open up markets and to enforce property rights. So it really wants to expand intellectual property rule in places like China. It wants to expand markets for U.S. financial interests and overseas, but it doesn't want to open up domestic agricultural sector. So it's sort of working with the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TAFTA deal to try and do what it wants and not avoid liberalizing these other things. So that's where the sort of fun is, watching that stuff go down. And it's going to be a very interesting and important thing to watch for the rest of this year, particularly the TPP legislation and deliberations in Congress. For people who care about getting to the healthy, wealthy corner, like Hans Rosling, we're going to have a very hard time getting there if deals like the TPP go through, because they basically expand drug patents for extra long period of time, making access for poor people to essential medicines very difficult indeed. And that's what drug makers in this country want. They want their monopolies to be protected for as long as possible. And they've prevailed in setting policy at the US Trade Representative's office. The other thing I should say, of course, is the reason why the farm sector is the least liberalized of all the US economic sectors is that you can't offshore Iowa, you can't offshore Kansas, in these places, all the farming infrastructure that's in place can't be moved overseas. And the Senate represents those places very powerfully.
So I was wondering how countries will deal with net neutrality and globalization because of today's FCC ruling. So how is it going to be competing with countries that do exercise net neutrality and those that don't?
Wow. I have not thought about this at all. I don't even know, do other countries already allow the opposite of net neutrality, like fast speed lanes for advertisers and things like that?
I'm not as familiar on that. So that's
yeah. I mean, this ruling is just about the US, and they're saying they're going to treat it like a utility, which I think is a good thing. Right? From the perspective of consumer rights, it's a good thing. We have no choice. If you get internet here in Seattle, you have two choices, right? So it's ridiculous. You can't shop around for a better deal from someone. You're stuck with a provider, and then they're going to pump the adverts to you faster, and there's nothing you can do about it. And your email's sitting there for 2 hours, downloading. It's ridiculous. So I'm very glad they passed net neutrality, but how that plays out internationally, I have no idea at all. I mean, the Chinese, of course, have the Great Wall, the Great Firewall, and that's complete opposite of net neutrality as well. So I don't know. I'm just bumbling around for an answer to your question. It'd be a very interesting thing to examine, but I don't know what other countries are really doing. Yeah.
I can think of an example.
Yeah.
Skype in South Korea. South Korea actually banned Skype usage completely to favor the local telecoms.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Well, thanks for that. One of the problems, occupational challenges of trying to deal with a topic like globalization is that it gets you in over your head in all sorts of areas. I have 10 chapters in this book. They range from commodities all the way through to health. And I have agreed on a contract with the publishers to bring out a second edition. And they want 3 new chapters. So I'm now going to do a chapter on migration, a chapter on culture, and a chapter on the environment. And I'm really going to be hard pushed to do that well and then come to a podium and speak authoritatively about all those things. But that's kind of what writing a textbook like this puts you in that kind of position. So I think the thing I like to emphasize, I emphasize it in the book and I emphasize it when I talk to students, is that knowledge making in a globalized age is a highly collaborative endeavor. And knowledge making always has been collaborative, but now more so than ever. And we have to valorize that and not look to individuals as the grand gurus and experts, but relish the deliberation and the crowdsourcing of knowledge. And the fact that people in the back of the room know about Skype is one example of that.
We have a written question here. Let me see if I can read it. Since China is such a powerful country now, because their Great Wall, they have a Great Wall, I guess, would you say China is anti-globalization?
I think I really try to avoid using the word anti-globalization. It hardly applies to anybody or anything. Maybe there's someone in the Tea Party that is anti-globalization, but I bet you their clothes are made in China. Even their no, China is not anti-globalization by any means. The reason why it's grown its economy so fast and so much is precisely because it's adopted an export-led growth approach and very successfully worked out a way to get its products into Western supermarkets, in Western shops, and into our households. And it's not just about making sure the West consumes what's made in China, but in terms of buying it, but in funding that purchasing as well. So they've, as you probably all are aware, they've recycled their dollar profits, investing them in US treasuries, and by doing so have helped keep interest rates down in this country for a long period of time. One of the reasons why we're not seeing, the things that the anti-inflationary hawks worry about. One of the reasons we're not seeing inflation, we're not, despite significant quantitative easing, is that there's plenty of people that want to invest in U.S. assets. And they buy dollars to do that, or they use dollars that they've made by selling us stuff to do that. And the Chinese have sort of, along with the Japanese, have been big on that. And so they've globalized their finance as well as their exports of goods. And that, I think, is a very obvious example of practicing market globalization. At the same time, as I indicated in my remarks, the Chinese are not allowing their people to engage in global debates over a variety of things. Much of the access to the internet is shut down, except for more commodity-based, capitalistic kind of practices. And there are a lot of restrictions on things like people's movement. I have a colleague at the University of Washington, Ken Wing Chan, who's a specialist on internal Chinese migration. He tells me that there's as many internal migrants in China as there are international migrants around the rest of the world. A huge population of like 130 million people, internal migrants in China, and who basically experience the kind of effective status of illegal aliens when they move to work in the cities, because they have rural hukou. They don't have the hukou that allow them to be full citizens in the cities. And these people, they have this sort of, their work is what they make, the goods they produce, the towers that they build. All of those things are about this thing we call globalization. They are connected to globalization, and yet their own movements, their own ability to access a global public is extraordinarily curtailed. So it's a very mixed story.
Dave, let me ask you a question. I'm going to ask Chris since I have the microphone, and then I'll give it to you, and you get to have the last word, or at least the last question. He gets to have the last word, though. My question is, and I have the benefit of having read your book and listened to you, but I would surmise from what you've said here tonight that the sector, the area where big G and small g, globalization has progressed the most is in the area of economics, both finance and trade. Where are the areas where it has progressed the least? Globalization has progressed the least.
Huh. Interesting. Well, it does come back to patterns of conflict, perhaps, areas where we're seeing people dig in, invoking ancient patterns of belonging. But I hesitate, as you can tell, to say they invoke ancient tribal traditions, because oftentimes what they're doing is reimagining religion, reimagining tribal tradition through tools that are often very globally interconnected. One of these characters that the Guardian, the British newspaper, exposed today, they've worked out the name of this guy that the British press called Jihadi John, that was involved in these horrible beheadings by Islamic State. And they've now worked out who he was, and he's acting in the name of ancient, like Islam or something. And President Obama's right; it's an utterly perverted vision of Islam that he's managed to concoct in an extraordinarily global way. Like, he was born in Kuwait, he studied computer science, he lived in West London, and now he's beheading people in Iraq. I mean, it's a ridiculous global journey, a horrible global journey, but it's not about like ancient religion and tribal belonging, which would be the kind of news media narrative that you typically get. So that's why I hesitate to say, oh, it's these conflicts and wars that are areas that are not connected to globalization. Perhaps it's things, yeah, perhaps it's very simple things like loving pets and families and things like that are the least globalized. But, my family circulates pictures of pets from Tunbridge, where I grew up, to Seattle on Facebook, and well, the pets get globalized that way too. It's really hard to think of things that aren't globalized.
I have to comment. You mentioned the 50s as an era of growth in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
That was nearly the peak of unionization in America.
Yep.
And the other comment is about the banking industry that nearly put us all. So what's your views on the opposing forces between unionization and unfettered banking?
Well, simple answers is that the banks won and the unions lost, right? The bankers seem to keep winning, and they've managed to work out the trick of turning every single financial crisis to their own advantage. I mean, that's the most amazing thing. Whereas unions, which were traditionally talked about as by their critics for doing that, for turning moments of economic malaise into organizing opportunities, have not been successful at doing that in the period since the high water mark of the 50s and 60s. And I think there are many reasons why not. I mean, one is, on the union side, a fact that many of the unions, despite the fact that they have international in the title of the union, the International Brotherhood of blah, 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 are not good at internationalizing their activities. The exception of the port workers on the West Coast is a good exception, but most, and the SEIU, the Service Workers International Union, have been more proactive. But unions find it very hard to expand that solidarity internationally for all sorts of cultural, political reasons, linguistic reasons, lack of resources, those sorts of reasons. Mainly, I think, though, because the pattern of labor organizing that got going and succeeded in the post-war period of the 50s and 60s was very nationally based. It was a national unionism. It was about balancing, like the government allowed unions to work to help them balance national mass production and national mass consumption and arrange a kind of harmonious relationship with between labor and industry. That's what all got upset by the globalization, outsourcing that started in the 70s and expanded into the 80s. And unions like Trumka, one of the leaders of the AFL-CIO, have said, they've been playing catch-up ever since. The corporations went global and unions didn't. But one of the other things that's been bad for unions is that they have been deliberately attacked. Right? It's not just they had a bad set of cards to play, but they've been deliberately attacked and marginalized. There's legislation against that makes it very hard for them to organize. They've been smeared, and they've been sort of seen as historical, bygone, pariahs that are against entrepreneurial dynamism and adaptation in the era of the global economy. So, and I think, it's a terrible shame because the things that a lot of unions did were terrific for working families, and the protections they secured have been undermined and lost, and we see people living very miserable lives and suffering a lot as a result.
Okay, I think we need to end it there. I hope you've all enjoyed Professor Sparke's remarks, and please join me in giving him another round of applause.